A millionaire gave a homeless man $500. The next day, he's stunned by how it's spent. James Hawthorne stood in front of his expansive window, gazing out over the skyline of the city. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the glass towers and luxury cars below. It was a view he had seen countless times, a view that had lost its luster but remained a symbol of everything he had built over the years. He was a millionaire, a titan of industry. His company had expanded globally, and he had everything a man could want: wealth, power, influence. He spent his days in boardrooms, making deals, and attending events with other high society elites. Money was never an issue for him, and if there was ever a problem, it could be solved with a few phone calls, a few zeros on a check. But despite all the success, there was a gnawing emptiness inside him. James had always thought that wealth was the answer to everything. But now, in the quiet of his lavish office, a rare feeling of dissatisfaction lingered. He had built his empire, but it felt hollow, disconnected from the people he once cared about, and distant from anything that made life feel real. He turned away from the window, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. He was getting older. The work never stopped, and neither did the pressure. His father's legacy was a constant reminder of how much more there was to accomplish. But he didn't feel the joy of success anymore. He felt like a machine running on autopilot. In the streets below, the city carried on in its usual frenzy. People rushed by, lost in their own worlds, focused on their daily routines. Among them was David, a man who had lived his life in stark contrast to James's. David had once been like any other man, dreaming of success, a better life, and a future full of possibilities. But life had a way of turning those dreams into dust. He had ended up on the streets, a victim of circumstances beyond his control, yet still managing to find moments of grace amidst his suffering. David had been living on the streets for 2 years. His clothes were ragged, his face was unshaven, and his hands were calloused from searching for food, sleeping in alleys, and surviving in a world that had forgotten him. Yet, despite the hardships, David was not bitter. He had learned to adapt, to survive. The streets were full of people who had lost their way, but David had a quiet dignity about him. He never begged for change, and he rarely asked for help. But he did what he could to survive, through small jobs, kind gestures from strangers, and the occasional handout. It was one of those days when he was sitting on the corner near the park, his usual spot, when the unexpected happened. A luxury car pulled up across the street, its engine purring softly as the driver got out. David barely took notice. He was used to the rich driving by, their windows tinted, their eyes closed to the reality of the world outside their bubbles. But then the driver stepped toward him, a tall man in a sharp suit. James paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on the homeless man sitting on the corner. He had seen people like him before, though he never paid much attention to them. Homelessness was something he could easily ignore from the comfort of his own world. But something about this particular man, the way he sat there, quiet, almost resigned, struck a chord with James. He didn't know why he did it. Maybe it was the combination of his growing dissatisfaction with his life, the loneliness that seemed to gnaw at him even in crowded rooms, or maybe it was just the momentary impulse to do something good. He reached into his wallet, pulling out a crisp $500 bill, and walked over to David. David looked up as James approached, blinking against the sunlight. His face was weathered from years on the streets, but his eyes held a sharpness, a quiet awareness of everything around him. "Here," James said, holding out the bill. "I don't know what your situation is, but I thought this might help." David didn't immediately reach for the money. He simply looked at it, then back at James. I don't need charity," he said quietly, his voice hoarse but steady. James was taken aback by the response. Most people would have grabbed the money immediately, grateful for any help. But this man, David, was different. He wasn't asking for help, nor was he demanding anything. "You could use it," James pressed, feeling a bit of discomfort. "I know what it's like to struggle." David considered the money for a moment, then shook his head. "It's not that I don't need it. I just don't want a handout. If you really want to help, I'd rather earn it." I can do something for you if you want. James's brow furrowed. He wasn't used to this kind of response. He'd given money to homeless people before, just to get them out of his sight or to feel like he had done something good for the day. But David wasn't like the others. There was no desperation in his eyes, no pleading for help. I don't need anything from you, James said, a little impatient now. I just thought you might be able to put this to better use. David took the money, his fingers brushing against James's. Thank you, he said simply. I'll put it to good use, don't worry. James nodded, unsure of what else to say. He turned to leave, but something stopped him. He turned back, watching David for a moment longer. The homeless man wasn't counting the money or looking at it like it was a windfall. Instead, he tucked it into his coat pocket and went back to sitting against the wall, as if nothing had changed. The next morning, James woke up to his usual routine. His assistant, Sarah, reminding him of meetings, calls, and events. As he sat in his office overlooking the city, he couldn't shake the image of David from his mind. The way he had accepted the money, not with gratitude or desperation, but with a quiet dignity. He pushed the thought aside, but as the day went on, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He found himself wondering what had become of David. What had he done with the $500? James stood there for a few moments, silent, his mind racing. The city buzzed around him, but it felt distant, as if he were trapped in a bubble, seeing everything around him but not truly engaging. The money, the power, the success, all of it had seemed so important. But now, after hearing David's words, everything seemed to lose its luster. What was the point of it all if he hadn't learned to see beyond himself? If he hadn't learned to truly connect with the world and the people in it? He looked at David, sitting on the corner with the group, his calm demeanor still radiating that quiet wisdom. He was a man who had nothing, yet somehow he had everything that James had been searching for. Purpose, connection, peace. You're right, James finally said, his voice barely a whisper. I've been living in a bubble. I've been so focused on my wealth and my business that I forgot what it means to actually live. David didn't say anything at first, just nodded as if he'd heard these words before, like he understood. Then, after a beat, he gave James a small, knowing smile. Man, it's never too late. You can change. But you've got to be ready to give, not just take. James took a deep breath, the weight of the realization settling in his chest. He had been looking for fulfillment in the wrong places. His penthouse, his stock portfolio, his high-powered meetings. But now, standing here with David, he felt a stirring deep within him, a yearning to do something more, something that would leave a lasting impact. I've been so blind, James said, his eyes searching David's face, a flicker of gratitude and apology in his gaze. You've opened my eyes to something I didn't know I was missing. I don't know how to change it, but I want to try. I want to be part of something real. David nodded again, his face softening. Start small. Find people who need help, not because it's your responsibility, but because you want to. It's not about being a hero. It's about showing up every day. The next few days were a blur for James. The meetings, the conference calls, the piles of paperwork. None of it felt the same. As he sat in his office, his usual focus on numbers and charts began to feel insignificant. He couldn't stop thinking about David and what he had said. David wasn't the only one who needed help. James had spent years focusing on building his wealth, on climbing the ladder. But somewhere along the way, he had neglected the very essence of what made life meaningful, human connection. James reached out to his assistant, Sarah, the next morning. I want to start working with local charities, he said, his voice firm, determined. I don't want to just donate money. I want to be involved. I want to understand the people we're helping, not just write checks. Sarah paused for a moment, surprised by the shift in his tone. Of course, Mr. Hawthorne. I'll get right on it. Later that week, James visited his first shelter. It was nothing like the glossy charity galas he was used to attending. There were no polished speeches, no elegant catering. It was a small, humble place, filled with people in need. But what struck James the most was how open everyone was to him. They didn't see him as a millionaire or a businessman. They saw him as a human being who was willing to listen. He spent the afternoon speaking to the shelter's residents, hearing their stories, offering help in whatever way he could. It wasn't easy. There were moments of discomfort, questions he didn't know how to ask, situations he didn't know how to navigate. But he persevered, pushing past the awkwardness. And by the end of the day, when he left the shelter, he felt something shift inside him. He felt more alive than he had in years. The following week, James found himself back on the streets. But this time, he wasn't alone. He had started volunteering at various shelters, helping in any way he could. He began speaking to more people, listening to their stories, learning about their struggles, and trying to understand what it was like to live without the luxury he had always taken for granted. And it wasn't just charity anymore. He was truly engaging with people. He began to see their humanity, and in doing so, he started to see his own life through a different lens. One afternoon, James found himself back in the park near the corner where he had met David. He wasn't sure why he was there, but it felt like the right place to be. He stood near the spot where he had handed over the $500, scanning the faces in the crowd. And then, just like before, he saw David sitting on the same corner. But this time, David was surrounded by a small group of people. Some homeless, some not. James hesitated, unsure whether to approach. But then, David looked up and saw him. Back again. David called with a grin, standing up and walking over. "Didn't think I'd see you so soon." James laughed, though the sound was tinged with nervousness. "I've been thinking about a lot of things, about how I've been living, and, well, I think I owe you an apology." David raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. "An apology? For what?" "For thinking that I could just give you money and make everything okay," James said, shaking his head. "For assuming that you were just a problem to be solved. But I've realized that I was wrong. Giving is not just about throwing money at a problem. It's about understanding. It's about connecting with people, not just fixing things." David's face softened, and for the first time, James saw a true warm smile. "Man, you're getting it." James felt a wave of emotion hit him, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly seen. Not for his wealth or his status, but for the person he was trying to become. "You're right," James said, his voice quiet. "I've been blind to what really matters." David placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's never too late to see things differently. You've got more power to change things than you think." James nodded, his chest swelling with a mix of gratitude and humility. "Thank you, David. You've taught me more than I ever expected." From that day forward, James continued his work with the homeless shelters, and slowly but surely, his focus shifted. His business took a backseat to the work he was now doing. The more he learned, the more involved he became, using his wealth and influence to help others. Not just by donating, but by offering his time, his energy, and his commitment to creating long-lasting change. As for David, he never asked for anything in return. He continued to help others, to share his newfound purpose, and to give as much as he could. Though his circumstances hadn't changed, his outlook on life had. And that, as James learned, was the true gift. As the weeks went by, James found himself more immersed in the work he had started. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was someone who was trying to change, trying to use the resources he had to make a tangible difference in the world. At first, his colleagues and even his family questioned his shift in priorities. They couldn't understand why he was spending so much time with the homeless, volunteering at shelters, and trying to fund local initiatives. "You're a businessman, James," his brother Richard told him one evening at dinner, clearly exasperated. "This isn't you. You've built an empire. What's the point of giving it all up to chase after this?" James looked at his brother, his face hardening slightly. "I'm not giving anything up, Richard. I'm just realizing that I've been spending my life chasing the wrong things. Money doesn't bring happiness. It's about connection, making a real difference." Richard scoffed, clearly unconvinced. "What, are you going to become a social worker now? You've got responsibilities. People depend on you." James clenched his jaw, but he held his ground. "People depend on me for more than just money. I've been blind to that. I'm not throwing everything away. I'm just learning that there's more to life than what I've been taught." Meanwhile, David was living his life as usual, on the streets, but not in the same way he had before. His spirit was lighter, his days more purposeful. He had started using the small resources he had to continue helping others. People from the shelter would sometimes give him donations for food or supplies, and he would pass those along to other homeless people who were in even worse shape. One day, as David sat outside the shelter, talking to a friend, he saw a familiar figure walking toward him. It was James. This time, there was no confusion, no hesitation from either of them. There was a quiet understanding between them now. James had been to the shelter many times, but today he was carrying something wrapped up in a plastic bag. He walked over to David with a smile that wasn't filled with pity, but respect. "I thought I'd bring you some new clothes," James said, holding up the bag. "Not much, but I thought it might help." David raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "I didn't expect that, but thanks, man. That's a bit of a change from the usual." James chuckled softly, handing over the bag. "Well, I'm trying to do things differently these days, and I figured it might make your day a little easier." David accepted the bag, his expression softening as he took it. "You know, James, you're doing more than just handing out clothes or money. You're showing up, you're actually seeing people. That's what makes a difference." James was quiet for a moment, the weight of those words sinking in. "It's not easy, you know. I've been caught up in my own world for so long. I never realized how much I was missing, how much we were all missing." David nodded, understanding. "Most people just pass us by. They throw $1 in a cup or maybe give us some food, but they don't really see us. You're doing something a lot harder. You're looking, you're seeing, and that's where the change starts." James thought about that as they stood there, the silence between them comfortable, almost companionable. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't even know if what he was doing would lead to lasting change. But he knew one thing for sure. David had taught him that true wealth wasn't found in money. It was in the relationships you built, in the lives you touched. James began spending more time with David, not just as a philanthropist or a man with a need to feel good about himself, but as a friend. They would meet up on the streets, sometimes with other members of the homeless community, just to talk and share stories. James, who had once been so isolated in his own world, found solace in these interactions, in the raw honesty and the unfiltered lives of those who had so little but gave so much. One afternoon, as they sat on a bench near the park, David turned to James, his face serious. "You know, you've been coming around a lot, and it's good. But I gotta ask, what's your angle here?" David asked, his tone both curious and cautious. James looked at him, surprised by the question, but he answered honestly. "No angle, David. I'm just learning. I'm learning that my life doesn't have to be about climbing higher or making more money. It's about understanding people, about showing up and giving back. I'm just trying to do something real for once." David studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right then, just don't forget why you're here. It's not about you proving something to yourself. It's about being here for the right reasons. The people here, we've seen so many people come and go, throw a little money our way, and then forget we exist the next day. I just want to make sure you're not that guy." James's chest tightened at the thought. "I get it. I don't want to be that guy." "I won't be." David smiled, a slight but genuine smile. "Good. And you'll make a difference, James. You're already doing it." As the months passed, James's work with local shelters and community organizations grew. He became known for more than just his donations. He started taking an active role in fundraising, organizing events, and even speaking at conferences about homelessness and poverty. He was no longer just the wealthy businessman. He was someone who had learned the true value of human connection and was using his resources and influence to make the world a better place. One day, James was sitting in his office, reviewing reports and answering emails, when Sarah knocked and entered. "Mr. Hawthorne, there's someone here to see you." "A Mr. David Williams?" James's heart skipped a beat at the name. He had been expecting to see David soon, but it was always on the streets or in the shelter, never in his office. "Send him in," James said, standing up as the door opened. David walked in, looking different from the last time James had seen him. His face was more worn, but there was a certain confidence in his step, a quiet pride that had been missing before. He wasn't wearing a suit, but he looked like a man who had come into his own, someone who knew his worth. "David," James said, extending a hand. David shook it firmly, his eyes meeting James's with a warmth that spoke volumes. "I just wanted to thank you," David said. "You've given me more than just money. You've given me the chance to help others, to make a real difference. I'm starting a foundation, focused on getting people off the streets and giving them a chance to rebuild. And I want you to be a part of it." James's heart swelled with emotion. This was the moment he had been working toward, the moment he had hoped for. Not just to help someone else, but to inspire them to take the lead and make their own change. "I'm in," James said without hesitation. "Let's do it." As they shook hands, both men knew this was the beginning of something bigger. James had found his purpose, and David had found the strength to turn his life around and help others. Together, they would continue to build a future, one where compassion and humanity weren't defined by wealth or status, but by the genuine acts of kindness and the willingness to stand up for what was right. And in the end, it was clear that both men had been given far more than $500. They had been given the chance to truly live. James sat back in his chair, reflecting on the conversation he had just had with David. The meeting had been a turning point, David's foundation, a project designed to help those on the streets, to provide them with resources, support, and, most importantly, a sense of purpose, was something James had never imagined he'd be involved in. He had been used to business plans, boardroom strategies, and calculated risks, but this was something that had no blueprint, no formula. This was about real lives, real change. And yet, in the midst of the initial excitement, James couldn't shake the lingering feeling of uncertainty. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. David had the heart and the vision, but it was James's influence, his financial support, and his business acumen that would help turn David's dream into reality. James knew that if they were going to succeed, they would have to fight the indifference of the world, the apathy that so often came with privilege. The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, calls, and brainstorming sessions. James and David began to work closely together, planning out the foundation's initiatives. They started small, offering job training, securing shelter for people who had nowhere to go, and providing resources like clothing, food, and medical care. But as the weeks passed, they realized the depth of the problem they were dealing with. Helping the homeless wasn't just about providing them with food or a bed for the night. It was about breaking the cycle of poverty, the sense of hopelessness that surrounded these individuals, and giving them the tools to rebuild their lives. David was the heart of the operation. He had spent years on the streets, and his experience gave him an authenticity that resonated with the people they were trying to help. He had a natural ability to connect, to listen, to offer empathy, and it was this that made the difference. James, on the other hand, used his wealth and influence to expand their reach. He spoke with local government officials, investors, and businesses, encouraging them to invest in the foundation to help fund their initiatives. He had always known how to close a deal, but now his approach was different. Instead of focusing on profit margins, he was focusing on people. He was trying to show them that the true wealth of a community came not from its buildings or businesses, but from its people. But there were moments of frustration. James had always been a problem solver, someone who was used to getting things done quickly. But social issues didn't work the same way as business ventures. Every problem they tried to solve had layers, histories, complexities that couldn't be fixed with a check or a quick decision. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings and strategizing, James sat alone in his office, staring at the city lights below. It was late, and the office was quiet, except for the sound of his breathing and the soft hum of the city in the distance. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a text from David. "We're going to a shelter tonight to talk to the people. Want to join?" James paused, reading the message again. He had been to plenty of shelters, but usually as an outsider, someone who made donations or signed checks. He had never been in a shelter with the purpose of connecting, of understanding the struggles of those inside. He thought about it for a moment, then typed back, "I'll be there." The shelter was located on the outskirts of the city, in a district where the streets were dirtier, the air heavier, and the people more broken. The building was a modest one, nothing like the sleek offices James was accustomed to, but it had warmth and humanity within its walls. As he stepped through the door, the first thing that hit him was the smell of old food, wet clothing, and the underlying scent of desperation. But there was also something else, something he hadn't expected, a sense of community. David was already there, talking to a group of people. He wasn't preaching to them or making speeches. He was sitting with them, listening to their stories, asking questions, offering encouragement. It was clear to James that David was more than just the foundation's figurehead. He was someone these people trusted, someone who had lived through the same struggles they had. James sat quietly in the corner, observing. He watched as David spoke with an elderly woman who had been living on the streets for years. Her face was lined with age and hardship, but when she spoke to David, she smiled. There was a warmth in her eyes that James had never seen before. David looked up and saw James, then waved him over. "James," he said, his voice soft but firm, "this is Maria. She's been here for a while now. We're working on getting her back on her feet." Maria smiled at James and extended her hand. "Nice to meet you. I hear you're helping David make things happen around here." James took her hand and shook it, still taken aback by how real this moment felt. This wasn't some business deal or charitable act. It was human connection. It was what he had been missing all along. "It's an honor to meet you, Maria," James said, his voice sincere. "I'm doing what I can to help." David looked at him, then nodded toward another man sitting alone in the corner, his face hidden behind a hood. "That's John. He's been through a lot. He's one of the reasons I started this foundation." James hesitated for a moment, then nodded and walked over to John. He wasn't sure what to say, but as he sat down next to him, he felt a strange sense of connection. John didn't look at him at first, but after a few moments he spoke. "I don't need your pity, man," John said, his voice rough. "I'm not here to pity you," James replied, his tone calm. "I'm here to listen, to understand." John looked at him for a moment, his eyes narrowing as if trying to read James. Then, after a long pause, he spoke again. "You got money. You think you can fix everything with that?" James swallowed hard. "No, I used to think that, but not anymore. I've learned that money can't fix everything, but people can. If we show up, if we listen and act, we can make a difference." John didn't respond right away. He looked at James for a moment longer, then shrugged, as if deciding James wasn't like the others. "Maybe," he said, "maybe there's hope in that." As the night wore on, James found himself talking to more and more people in the shelter. Each story was different, but they all had one thing in common: they were all about survival. These people had lived through unimaginable hardships, and yet here they were trying to make it through another day. By the end of the evening, James felt exhausted, emotionally drained in a way he never had before. He had been used to solving problems quickly, making decisions that affected the lives of thousands of people without ever really understanding them. But this was different. The next morning, as James sat at his desk, his mind swirling with the faces and stories from the shelter, he made a decision. The work they were doing wasn't just a project. It was his life now. This was what mattered. This was where he was needed. The money he had spent his life accumulating, the empire he had built, none of that mattered if he didn't use it to help others. He picked up the phone and dialed David. "David," he said, his voice steady, "I want to help you make this foundation a success. I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about using everything I have, everything I've learned, to make this work." David's voice on the other end was filled with warmth and surprise. "You're in, huh?" "I'm in," James replied. From that day on, James and David worked side by side, combining their strengths to build a lasting impact on the homeless community. James used his business skills to secure larger funding, and David, with his deep understanding of the streets, kept the foundation grounded in reality. Together, they made sure the initiative wasn't just about providing temporary help. It was about empowering people to rebuild their lives and giving them the tools to create sustainable change. And in the process, both James and David learned something powerful. James learned that wealth was only valuable when it was shared, and David learned that no matter how hard life could get, there was always the chance to rebuild, to rise again, with the help of others. The foundation grew, and so did their bond. It wasn't just about saving the homeless. It was about transforming both of their lives in ways they never expected. The months passed quickly, each one marking a significant step forward for both James and David. What had started as a humble idea, a way to give back, had now turned into a fully fledged movement. The foundation they had built together was thriving, helping not just individuals on the streets, but entire communities. It was beginning to change the way people viewed homelessness, breaking down the stigmas that had been built up for years. James found himself growing more and more attached to the cause. His office, once filled with financial reports, stock tickers, and business plans, had been replaced with community outreach programs, meetings with shelter managers, and strategy sessions on how to expand their impact. He still ran his company, but his role had shifted. He was no longer just a businessman. He was a philanthropist and advocate for change. And as he became more involved, he began to see things differently. Not just in the world, but within himself. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was undeniable. Every time he walked into a shelter or spoke with someone whose life had been turned around by the foundation, he felt a warmth in his chest. It wasn't the hollow pride of a businessman completing a deal, but the deep, fulfilling sense of having made a difference. David had become more than just a partner in the foundation. He had become a friend, a mentor, someone who kept him grounded when the pressures of business and charity seemed overwhelming. They spent hours together, strategizing, discussing the complexities of their work, and sometimes just talking about life. One day, as they sat in a small cafe, enjoying a rare moment of downtime, David looked at James, his face thoughtful. "You know," David said, stirring his coffee slowly, "I didn't think we'd get this far. I thought you were just another guy who'd toss me a few bucks and then forget I existed." James glanced up from his coffee, meeting David's eyes. "I don't blame you for thinking that. I probably would have thought the same if I were in your shoes." David chuckled softly, his gaze turning distant for a moment. "But you didn't forget. You stuck around. And now we've built something bigger than either of us thought possible." James nodded. "I didn't understand what you meant when you said that giving was about seeing people. But now I get it. It's not just about handing out money. It's about seeing people for who they really are, seeing their potential, their humanity." David's expression softened. "That's the thing. When you're on the streets, when you're out there fighting just to survive, people stop seeing you. They stop looking at you like you're a person. And that's the hardest part. You start to feel like you don't matter." James was silent for a moment, the weight of David's words sinking in. "I can't imagine what that must feel like," he said softly. "I've never had to worry about whether I'd eat or where I'd sleep. I've always had choices." David met his gaze again, his eyes filled with understanding. "That's the thing. You've never had to fight for your existence. But for a lot of people, that's the daily battle. And all it takes is one small act of kindness. One person who sees you and says, 'You matter.' That's how everything starts to change." James leaned back in his chair, letting those words settle in. He had been so focused on fixing things, on finding solutions, that he had missed the simplest and most important truth. People didn't need to be fixed. They needed to be seen, heard, and treated with dignity. As the foundation grew, they started to see real results. The initiatives David had started, job training, rehabilitation programs, and community outreach, were having a measurable impact. More people were being placed into stable housing, finding jobs, and reconnecting with their families. The local government had even started to take notice, offering grants to expand the program further. But as things progressed, they began to face new challenges. The pressure to expand quickly, the competing interests of other organizations, and the skepticism of those who didn't believe a program like theirs could work all began to pile up. James and David often found themselves at odds about the direction they should take, especially when it came to balancing growth with quality. One evening, after a particularly heated discussion about how to allocate resources, James was exhausted. He was sitting alone in his office, poring over reports when his phone buzzed. It was a text from David. "Let's go for a walk. Need to clear my head." James put down his papers and grabbed his jacket. He didn't know why, but he was looking forward to this. Something about these quiet moments with David had a way of resetting his perspective. They met outside the shelter, the cool evening air a welcome contrast to the stuffiness of the office. They walked side by side, not saying much at first. There was something peaceful about the silence, the only sound coming from the distant hum of the city. David broke the silence first. "You're worried, aren't you? About the future of the foundation?" James exhaled slowly. "I am. We're growing faster than I ever expected. And I want to make sure we're doing it right, that we're helping the right people, that we're not just expanding for the sake of it." David nodded. "It's tough. I get it. But growth isn't just about numbers. It's about impact. The more people we can reach, the more lives we can change. But we can't forget why we're doing this." "I know. I keep getting caught up in the logistics, the business side of it all, and I forget that at the heart of it, it's about the people. Not the programs or the funding." David smiled, his expression softening. "That's why we're a good team. You bring the strategy, the vision. I bring the heart, the reality. We balance each other out." James grinned, the weight of the conversation lifting for a moment. "Yeah, I guess you do. I never would have gotten this far without you, David." David chuckled, glancing sideways at James. "And you wouldn't have gotten this far without some perspective. A little push from the guy who used to live on the street." James laughed softly. "Yeah, I suppose that's true. I think I've learned more from you than anyone else in my life." David stopped walking and turned to face him, his expression sincere. "James, don't lose sight of what matters. This isn't about proving something to the world. It's about making a difference, however small it is." "I won't forget," James said, his voice firm. "I'm here for the right reasons now. I'll make sure we keep our focus on what really matters." David smiled, clapping James on the back. "Good. Let's keep it that way." The next day, as they sat in another strategy meeting, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. The pressures of growth were still there. The obstacles still loomed, but he had something he hadn't had before: clarity. The work they were doing wasn't easy, but it was real, and that was enough. They moved forward with renewed determination. They didn't let the setbacks or the criticisms discourage them. They knew what they were building was worth it. James continued to use his influence to secure resources, but this time his approach was different. He wasn't just funding a charity. He was investing in a future, in a community that deserved to be seen. And as the foundation continued to grow, James and David remained grounded. Their friendship and shared mission the driving force behind everything they did. They knew there would always be more work to do, but they were ready. Together, they were changing the world, one life at a time. As the months passed, the foundation continued to grow, gaining traction in the community and attracting attention from various sectors. More businesses, local leaders, and even some government officials came on board, offering their support. James had proven that his vision was not only viable but necessary. The work he and David were doing was slowly reshaping how the world saw homelessness, not as an isolated issue but as a systemic problem that needed long-term, compassionate solutions. James found himself in a meeting one morning with a group of investors who had shown interest in supporting the foundation's growth. They sat around a sleek conference table, discussing financial projections and next steps for expansion. James was poised, his usual businesslike demeanor in full effect, but something felt different. He was no longer just trying to impress these investors with his business acumen. He was speaking from a place of purpose, from a real understanding of the work they were doing. "People don't want charity anymore," James said, leaning forward, his hands clasped on the table. "They want a chance to rebuild, to live with dignity. Our goal is to provide them with that chance, and we're already seeing results. This isn't just an investment in a charity. It's an investment in people, in the future of this community." The investors nodded, clearly impressed. There was a shift in the room, something palpable. This wasn't a pitch for a business. It was a pitch for humanity. James had come a long way from the man who used to walk past the homeless, pretending they didn't exist. Now, he was a man who could articulate not only the financial benefits of the work they were doing, but the intrinsic, life-changing power of the work itself. David, meanwhile, was still out in the field, working directly with the people they were helping. He never left the ground, always out there meeting the individuals who needed them the most. While James navigated the business side of the foundation, David ensured that every program remained grounded in reality, tailored to the needs of the people it served. Together, they complemented each other perfectly, each one using their strengths to push the foundation forward. One afternoon, James and David stood in front of one of the foundation's new projects, a shelter that had been converted into a job training and rehabilitation center. The building had once been dilapidated, a symbol of neglect, but now it was alive with energy and possibility. People were inside, learning new skills, working together, and most importantly, feeling seen and valued. David watched the group with a satisfied smile, his arms crossed. This is what we're here for, James. James nodded, his gaze following David's. This is more than I ever imagined, he said softly. I didn't think I could make a real difference in this world. But now I see that even the smallest act of kindness can create ripples that last. David turned to him, his face full of gratitude. You didn't just help fund a project, James. You changed the way people think. You gave them hope. It wasn't just the foundation that had changed over the months. James's personal life was also undergoing a transformation. The distance he had once maintained from his family, his colleagues, and his friends slowly started to close. He had begun to see the importance of balance, of not only building wealth but also building relationships. He reconnected with his estranged sister, Sarah, who had always been critical of his business practices. Maybe I was too harsh on you, Sarah said during one of their coffee meetings. I always thought you were just about the money, but I see now that you're doing something real, something that matters. James smiled, feeling a sense of relief. It's never too late to make changes, Sarah. I've learned that. He also found himself spending more time with his colleagues, those who had helped him create the foundation, but also those who had been skeptical of his shift in priorities. It wasn't just about making amends or proving himself. He had realized that the people in his life were just as important as the work he was doing. Relationships were the bedrock of everything. Without them, success felt empty. A year passed since that first meeting between James and David. The foundation was now one of the most successful and well-respected initiatives in the city. Its impact was being felt across multiple states, and James had been invited to speak at conferences about the work they were doing. But even with all the accolades, James never lost sight of why he had started this journey in the first place. It wasn't about recognition. It was about changing lives. One evening, as James was preparing to head out for another meeting, his phone buzzed with a text from David. It simply read, "We did it." James smiled as he read it, the weight of those 3 words settling deep in his heart. They had done it. Together, they had taken an idea, one that began with a small, seemingly insignificant act of kindness, and turned it into a movement that had changed lives. Not just the lives of the people they helped, but their own lives as well. Later that evening, James and David stood on the steps of the newly opened community center. Another project completed. It was a beautiful evening, the sky turning shades of pink and purple as the sun set. People were gathered, celebrating the success of the new facility. As James and David looked out over the crowd, James felt a sense of peace he had never known before. "I could have never done this without you, David," James said, his voice full of gratitude. David smiled, his eyes reflecting the same warmth and sincerity they had shared from the beginning. "You didn't have to do it alone, James. You just had to be willing to see the people who needed you." James nodded, his heart full. "I'm glad I did. I think this is just the beginning." David chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, it always is." They stood there for a moment, side by side, watching as the people they had helped laughed, danced, and celebrated the new chapter they were all starting. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, both men felt that whatever came next, they would face it together. James had learned that true wealth wasn't in the billions he had once accumulated. It was in the connections he had made, the lives he had touched, and the genuine love he had found in the simple act of giving. And in the end, It was clear that the $500 he had given to David on that fateful day had changed everything.